Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and we're doing something really exciting today. Today we have Sean Brown with us, who writes legacy articles on the site, also does a legacy podcast, and he is going to help us count down the 10 best legacy cards from Conspiracy Take the Crown. So, Sean, do you want to introduce yourself, tell people a little bit about where they can find you and what you do?
I'm a writer on MTG Goldfish, just like Seth here, and I write This Week in Legacy, which you can check out every week. And I also cast on the Australian Legacy podcast, The Salt Mine, and you can find us on iTunes and whatever. Yep.
Is Legacy pretty popular in Australia? Is there a good scene there?
Uh, it takes a lot for us to kind of build it up, I guess. We're working hard to get it strong. Some would say it was dying over the past years before, but it's had a bit of a renaissance now. And yeah.
Awesome. Well, I'm super excited to have you and to talk about these legacy cards because the second conspiracy actually looks pretty sweet for Eternal formats. I think, especially compared to the first one, where it was kind of like Council's Judgment and Dak Faden and nothing, and even Dak Faden and Council's Judgment are like kind of fringe one of cards. So I'm really
I
excited for
guess
this set.
yeah, I guess DAC is pretty big in vintage, but yeah, Council's Judgment felt like the only big one that.
All right, so let's jump into it. We're going to start at number 10, count down to number 1. So, number 10 on our list, we have Palace Jailer, taking advantage of one of the mechanics or keywords from the set Monarchy. So, where do you think this one fits, Sean?
Yeah, so as a 4-drop, it's a bit clunky, but as a 2-2, which we'll see later is tutorable now, it's very interesting as a removal spell that's with a body that's synergistic with flicker effects and also could possibly give you some card advantage as well.
Yeah, so what do you think about Monarchy and Legacy? Is that something where you would play a card specifically because you want to take the crown and be the monarch to draw an extra card? Or is that just kind of fringe upside on this, like, Shriekmaw, Banisher Priest type creature?
Well, I guess the thing is, it's not pure upside, though. It can shoot you in the foot.
That's true. I guess you'd have to build around it to try to make sure you were the monarch more than your opponent for it to really be good.
Definitely. So this card is kind of nice because it has an inbuilt way to kind of protect you, keep you the monarch, because it exiles a creature and makes sure that they're off the board. So that's nice.
So would this be like a Death and Taxes type card? Is that the kind of deck you'd see it in?
Potentially, I think it's a bit expensive for its mana cost, but as I said, we'll see later on that Death and Taxes is getting a bit of a shape-up, and more grindy cards like this that are tutorable might see a bit more play.
All right, so moving on to number 9 on our list, we have a black card, and this is Archdemon of Paliano. And this card, when I saw it, I thought there is no way this could see play. This has got to be something that was already printed because essentially it's just a vanilla 5/4 flyer. And then I actually looked into it, and black doesn't have a 4 mana 5 power flyer. It has like Abyssal Persecutor and Inverter of Truce that have these huge downsides, but they don't just have a vanilla 5 powered flyer at 4 mana. So what do you think about this one, Sean?
So as you said, like Abyssal Persecutor and Desecration Demon. Yeah, so a lot of these cards are these kind of undercosted big demons have actually kind of have their own deck. It's a very fringe deck called a Demon Stompy.
So would this be a piece of the Demon Stompy deck then?
Well, basically it replaces all those other fatties because this one's just a huge flyer that kills your opponent in 4 turns while they're locked out by Chalice of the Void or Trinisphere or things like that.
Ah, okay. So you think you would play this over Desecration Demon and Abyssal Persecutor in those cards? This just takes over their slot in that deck.
Yeah, because it's just as you said, it's a big giant flying demon that kills them in 4 turns, exactly the same as the other ones, except there's no downside.
Moving on to number 8 on our list, we have Sivala, Heart of the Wilds. This one reminds me a little bit of Raphellos, like a fixed Raphellos, but I want to hear your take on it, Sean.
So this is a really interesting card because when you see green creatures in Legacy, you really think of, wow, this is great because I can tutor for it with Green Sun Zenith. So Selvala's pretty nice in that she's kind of an engine.
So Nickfit is a Explorer Cabal Therapy based deck. It uses a Veteran Explorer and the fact that Legacy as a format doesn't play many basic lands. So if you have Veteran Explorer, which when you sacrifice it, you go get some basic lands and put them into play, both players do. If you have a bunch of basic lands and your opponent's playing like a Delver deck with no basic lands, you just ramped a bunch of mana for free, and you can start playing these gigantic creatures, which Selvala certainly appreciates.
Yeah, so how important is the mana ability on Savala? Like, do you need to be playing some, what, like four powered creatures to really make it worth it? Or is it fine on its own?
I think that's probably correct. Like you'd need some creatures with 4 power or so. At the same time, I'm not really thinking too much about her mana ability because once you've kind of got the cards flowing, I guess, I think that's where she'll really shine more so. I think the mana ability is a bit more gravy than if anything.
So it's all about the card draw, and the mana ability is just kind of a bonus.
Yeah, I think so. I think there'll be times where it might be relevant. But said with these kind of rampy decks, you should already have an abundance of mana already, and it's more about just continuing the flow of cards.
Sweet. Well, moving on to number 7 on our list, we have a little red creature, a goblin. This is Grenzo Havoc Raiser. So let me guess, this is probably something you're thinking about in goblins?
Yeah, well, that's initially where people have thought about this card.
But I think more relevant is probably the second ability because this combines of the token generators, and if you kind of prize the opponent with this, thanks to the haste from Goblin Warchief, you might be able to grab a bunch of good cards from them. Maybe cast your opponent's brainstorm or cantrips and things like that.
Yeah, it reminds me of Edric a little bit, but like a reverse Edric, where you're kind of drawing a card for each creature that you connect with, but instead of just drawing one from your deck, you're drawing one from your opponent's deck, which is pretty neat. And I guess it can be helpful for a deck like Goblins, which is sort of limited, being mostly mono red or primarily red. You don't get brainstorms and cantrips and all that kind of stuff. But if you can steal them from your opponent, I'm sure they'd be really good in your deck to be able to cast those once in a while.
Mm-hmm. I think the sad thing about this, though, is if only you'd be able to take the lands from your opponent, this ability would be very, very powerful. Because Goblins has a pretty high mana curve when they're casting Ringleader and things like that, and stealing lands could be pretty good. But I think this card could find a place maybe as a one-of to tutor for if you want to kind of get some card advantage or something like that. But at the same time, you already have huge card advantage engines of Goblin Ringleader and things like that, so it might not find a place. But it's certainly an interesting card.
And outside of Goblins, probably no real shot.
Well, there is the red prison decks of the format, colloquially known as Dragon Stompy, that like cards like this that generate some form of advantage while your opponent is imprisoned. But usually these cards aim for a mana cost of 2 colorless mana and a red. So the red of Grenzo, despite it being in a mono red deck, can be very restrictive when you're using Ancient Tombs and things like that. So casting something like Goblin Rabblemaster might be a bit better.
All right, moving on to number 6 on our list, we have a land. I think this might be the only rare land from Conspiracy 2, at least the only new one. Throne of the High City, so another Monarch card. What do you think about this one, Sean?
So this is a really interesting card well, it's a land, so most people would like to think of it as being a card in lands, the deck, because lands is very good at sort of stopping the opponent from attacking and dealing you damage with Maze of Ith. And once Throne of the High City makes you the Monarch, you can really get some Life from the Loam action going, maybe loaming twice within a turn and getting a huge advantage. So I think it's nice maybe as a one-of in the main or maybe in the sideboard, as something to dredge into when you're loaming and then really kind of lock up the game with a big card advantage engine.
Yeah, and it's kind of cool too because you have life from the loam and you're sacking it. So even if your opponent can somehow steal the monarchy from you, you can always loam back your throne and become the monarch again. So you have this built-in way. We were kind of talking about that white card, how it can be a downside if your opponent is the monarch for many turns in a row, they're drawing the extra card. But Throne of the High City not only makes you the monarch, but you can do that repeatedly. So it should be able to keep you the monarch in conjunction with life from the loam.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, I think it's a pretty interesting card there. But the only thing is, 4 mana is somewhat steep, so it might be a bit difficult if you're kind of get it in the early game. You won't be really using it much. So
All right, we're moving into the top 5 of our list, and we have our first Planeswalker. And I'm really interested to see what you think about Duretti Ingenious Iconoclast, Sean, because for me, this one felt like Dak Faden in the sense that it might be better in Vintage than Legacy, but I want to hear your Legacy thoughts on it.
So I definitely think in Vintage this card is very, very sweet with all the Moxen. But luckily in Legacy there are a few decks which have artifacts lying around to really abuse the -1. So the one that comes to mind for me is the deck called Tezzerator. It abuses a Tezzeret, Agent Bolus, and a bunch of random artifacts and things to generate a lot of advantage. Things like Chalice of the Void and things like that. And Duretti is very, very cool with Sword of the Meek because you can basically tick him up and down continuously because the sword keeps coming back into play as you create the construct. So you kind of create your own abyss while also having sword in your deck, which can combo with Thopter Foundry.
So, do you have to be playing a fairly heavy artifact deck? Is there any appeal to playing this and +1 to make a construct, -1 sack the construct, kill something? Or do you really need other artifacts to be sacking to make this worthwhile?
I think you do need other artifacts to make it worthwhile. I think on some board states, you're going to want Duretti to be able to just put him into play and sacrifice an artifact, like maybe a Seed of the Synod or a Mox Diamond that's lying around that's kind of useless now, and then kind of clear the board for you. So I think kind of having to tick him up and then go through all these hoops makes him a bit too restrictive. So definitely in terms of deck building, you'll have to be putting him in the right shell. I also think Duretti could be good in something abusing Goblin Welder because he makes constructs that you can use to weld away and things like that. So that's certainly cool too.
Is there any welder decks that are seeing a lot of play right now?
Anything that's in Duretti's kind of color would be something using Painter's Servant. So maybe a Grixis Painter deck or red-black Painter isn't really a thing. Most of them are either mono-red or white-red, but maybe you can stretch the mana base and find a place for him. But yeah, with Goblin Welder, I think he also has some potential for some kind of shenanigans.
All right, well, moving on to number 4 on our list, we go from Planeswalker to Planeswalker. And this is kind of the face card from Conspiracy Take the Crown, Kaya Ghost Assassin. So where does this one fish on?
So there's been a lot of great white planeswalkers recently. So Gideon, ally of Zendikar, has surprisingly ended up an all-star in Legacy in many decks. Death and Taxes sideboards have found him to be excellent, and some Stoneblade decks have found him to be pretty good as well. But Kaya offers something different in that kind of 4 mana slot. Unlike Gideon, who just is more about combat and bashing face, Kaya is disruptive and generates card advantage at the same time. So I think even just having Kaya as this 4 mana, make your opponent discard and you draw a card twice is pretty strong. So I like her maybe in a Stoneblade deck, Esper Stoneblade, Esper Deathblade, maybe out of the sideboard in those kind of grindy matchups where she'll shine.
How much value is there in the 0 ability, not only resetting Kaya potentially, but being able to blink a creature? Is that something that you would build the deck around? Is that a big calling card of Kaya, or is that kind of just if you happen to blink a Stoneforge and get a Jit to go along with your Batterskull, that's sweet?
No, I think, as I said, in those shells, you're going to look at her to not really do the cute stuff. You're going to look at her to just like draw me cards, please. But at the same time, blinking herself to keep it going, or blinking a Stoneforge, or a lot of the Deathblade lists now run Baleful Strix as well to just generate value, seems really, really good as well. So, yeah, I think she has a lot of value in those kind of grindy mid-range Stoneblade decks.
Main deck or sideboard, like you were saying about Gideon, do you think?
So the main thing with these 4 mana planeswalkers in Legacy is they're always competing against Jace the Mind Sculptor is the main problem. So a lot of the time though, you want planeswalkers out of the sideboard that can't be pyroblasted. So because tapping out for a big planeswalker and getting it pyroblasted, like Jace often does post board, is really, really bad. So that's why Gideon, Elspeth, Knight Errant, and Kaya now are some pretty good options from the sideboard. But I can see one in the main as well. It's certainly a consideration there too.
All right, moving into the top 3 cards from Conspiracy Take the Crown, we have a card that I've heard a lot of different things about. The Commander community is sort of freaking out and saying this card is going to be busted, but I'm interested to hear if it fits in Legacy, and this is Leovold, Emissary of Trest. So where does this one fit, Sean?
So that's the hard thing I have about Leovold. I'm not sure where he fits. When I look at what he says, his text, he's a 3/3 for 3 mana. It's perfectly reasonable-ish, but each player can't draw more than one card. Well, each opponent can't draw more than one card each turn is really, really relevant in Legacy in a format that's so heavy on cantrips, shutting down their brainstorms, shutting down their ponders. Everyone's already seen how powerful at times Spirit of the Labyrinth can be, and Leovold's on a much better body. And he has another ability, which, although in Legacy, I think it will mainly be that Leovold cycles himself if he gets killed. It's certainly a good ability. Like, the overall package is very, very strong. But the thing is, I'm not sure where he fits in. Most of the bug decks now are Shardless Bug, which use Shardless Agent as their premier 3-drop, and it's a bit crowded at that slot. You don't really want to be playing more 3-drops, especially ones that a creature that you can't cascade into. So I'm not sure if there needs to be some kind of new bug control deck that can be created for Leovold, or maybe he goes into other shells like I mentioned Nick Fit before. This guy can be Green Sun Zenith so that's pretty nice. There's been banned Deathblade decks have been going around. So these are kind of a 4-color banned splashing black deck. They can accelerate Leovold out on turn 2 thanks to Deathrite. And that sounds pretty crippling as well.
That's the nice thing about Legacy is it's just so easy if you want to. If you're a Bant color deck, you can play Leovold, and there is some cost there with Wastelands and Blood Moons in some decks, but it's fairly easy to add in 1 extra color of mana if you want to without a very high cost.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of had the same feelings as you did about the Shardless Agent decks. You got Shardless Agent, you got Liliana, you have a lot of stuff in that 3-drop slot, and Shardless Agent does something right away. That's my one thing I'm worried about with Leovold is it actually doesn't do much when you cast it. Like, yes, if your opponent's going to brainstorm or has a Jace, the first ability does something, but in some matchups, it's just a 3/3 for 3, and your opponent beats you down with an Emrakul and doesn't even care about your Leovold.
I think the interesting thing though is Shardless Agent creates a lot of deck building restrictions. You can't play things like Flusterstorm or Spell Pierce or Daze because cascading into those is terrible. So Leovold offers a 3-drop in the bug colors, which generates some form of advantage similar to Shardless Agent. Not as obvious, I guess, but a bit more subtle in some ways, but also make sure that your deck is free from the deck building restrictions that Cascade forces you into. So, as I said, maybe some new kind of bug control shell might be created from Leovold, or, as I said, maybe people just realize Shardless Agent is the better way to go. But I think it's a powerful card. Accelerating into it on turn 2 off Deathrite Shaman seems very, very strong when your opponent's hand is full of cantrips. So I think he might find a place somewhere. I'm just not sure where.
Well, before we started recording, we both were in agreement that while there's a lot of cool cards in Conspiracy 2 for Legacy, it was really the top two cards on our list that are the most obviously powerful for Legacy. So let's move into the top two with number 2, Sanctum Prelate. So kind of a similar to Chalice of the Void, but on a body. What do you think of this one, Sean?
This card, when this card was released, when both of these cards were released, I basically was paralyzed from being able to do anything. University study and random things, but I just sat down and wrote heaps of deck lists on my journal because Sanctum Prelate feels it's probably going to revolutionize a lot of Legacy. Sanctum Prelate obviously goes into Death and Taxes and is probably a very powerful card there. But not people seem to think that's really the only place, but really it can go in so many decks. Basically any deck that's, reasonably white, a Stoneblade deck, for example, can use this to cripple Abrupt Decay just by naming 2, and Miracles could even use it out of the sideboard to protect the counterbalance lock. So this card is extraordinary. I'm not sure what else to say about it. I think it's going to be great against fair decks, incredibly good against combo decks, and is really just an all-star,
So with Chalice of the Void, because of the double X cost, usually set at 0, 1, maybe 2, and that's pretty much it for most decks. How big of a deal is it that you get to just choose a number? So if you want to, you can name 6 and not get hit by Terminus, for example. Like, is that a big deal with this card, or just kind of a fringe application?
No, I think it's an incredibly big deal. I play a lot of Death and Taxes myself. It's really my main deck. And Phyrexian Revoker, Sanctum Prelate to me feels like almost like this super powered Phyrexian Revoker. Because Phyrexian Revoker, basically, you lock out the card that you think will kind of make the opponent crawl back into the game. Sometimes you blind Revoker and say, I need to name Liliana of the Veil, because that's going to make my Mirren Crusader be edicted away, and then I'll lose the game against Shardless Bug, or something like that. But Sanctum Prelate takes it to another level. Basically, you think of the card which is going to get your opponent to crawl back into the game, like the Terminus, like the Tendrils of Agony that they'll use for the win, and completely shut that out. And basically, I mean that you can just continue on beating in with your little 2/2 idiots and win the game.
Yeah, this card seems really good. I'm a huge Chalice of the Void fan, so anything that even kind of looks like Chalice of the Void is pretty exciting to me, just because I really like locking people out of doing things. Where do you think, how does it compare to Chalice of the Void? Is this something you would play with Chalice of the Void in a straight up, like, kind of prison style deck, or not so much?
I think in a prison style deck, Sanctum Prelate is also great. Again, imagine going land, Mox Diamond, Chalice of the Void, land, Sanctum Prelate. That's absurd. You're going to lock your opponent out from playing Magic completely. But at the same time, I don't think it needs to be played in combination with Chalice of the Void. I think people are thinking of it as a way to just stop your opponent from doing things. But I think it's also, as I said, a way to make sure that you shut your opponent out from crawling back into the game. Unlike Chalice, which can be played on turn 1 and is kind of used to immediately cripple them, Sanctum Prelate, I think, really appreciates you knowing what your opponent's deck is and knowing what converted mana cost is going to be really strong against you. So I think it will take a bit of play, a bit more play than Chalice of the Void, which, as you said, is kind of just 0 or 1. Sanctum Prelate requires a bit more kind of a soul reading at times, as I said, similar to Phyrexian Revoker, but much more superpowered.
So one more question. You said you're a Death and Taxes player. How does this fit into your deck? Are you playing X number in the main, X in the side, or are you still figuring that out?
I guess that lets us segue into the next card then, doesn't it?
All right, well, moving on to number 1, another white card, and it is Recruiter of the Guard. Basically the reverse Imperial Recruiter in some sense, searches by toughness rather than power. A 1/1 for 3, so this is number 1 on our list. What do you think about this one, Sean?
So, as you said, Sanctum Prelate, how many number will I play in Death and Taxes? Well, now that I can go and tutor for it with Recruiter of the Guard, maybe I don't need to run that many anymore. So, Recruiter of the Guard is going to probably revolutionize the entire Death and Taxes archetype. The deck had problems at times drawing the wrong hate bear for the wrong matchup. Sometimes you'll draw your Stoneforge Mystic against a combo deck and you'll be sad that it's not a Thalia. But now with Recruiter, as long as you get past turn 3, you'll be able to find the hate piece you need and slam it down and hopefully take the game from there. So there's been versions of Death and Taxes before that have splashed red for Imperial Recruiter and Magus of the Moon. So now Recruiter of the Guard allows you to stay mono white, not have a fragile mana base, which that deck did have, and also looks for toughness, which is very, very important because Death and Taxes one of its key cards is Flicker Wisp, which has a toughness less than 2. Imperial Recruiter couldn't find this, but Recruiter of the Guard can. So Recruiter of the Guard, if you want to just beat your fair opponents, can just summon an army of Flicker Wisps. You just get a Flicker Wisp, flicker your Recruiter again, get a Flicker Wisp, flicker your Recruiter again, and suddenly you have an army of 3/1 flyers. So very, very powerful.
That seems especially insane if you can get a vial up to 3. Because then you just have like the ability to potentially cast Recruiter, search up your Flicker Wisp, vial in your Flicker Wisp, flicker your Recruiter or something else if you need to, and you can keep generating value. Plus, you have this like constant source of protection from something your opponent might do, a removal spell or something like that, because you can always vial in your Flicker Wisp.
Yeah, definitely. I think the only problem, and you mentioned this with Vial, Recruiter of the Guard is incredibly powerful with Aether Vial. But one thing about Death and Taxes is you have to make sure that the deck functions well without Aether Vial as well. So generally it does, but Recruiter of the Guard is actually a very slow card. A 3-mana 1/1 is not very good when you're getting like annihilated by Emrakul or something like that. So everyone has to keep in mind that Recruiter of the Guard, it's very powerful. It can tutor for basically your whole deck, but at the same time, it slows the deck down considerably, and you have to take into account that your curve might be shifted up a little bit more. So that's my only worry about it. The old Imperial Taxes list definitely had a curve concentrated more at the 3-drop spot, and mono white looks to go that same way as well. So it sacrifices some speed for some consistency, but it's still very good.
All right, well, let's see. I got 2 more questions for you on this one. First off, does this have potential in like Allurin or other non-Death and Taxes decks? I know it doesn't work like Imperial Recruiter because it can't search up the Painter's Servant for that combo because of the toughness restriction, but is this a part of other decks as well?
Yeah, so Allurin's the first one that definitely gets a big boost from Recruiter of the Guard. Allurin was incredibly restrictive to play in paper because Imperial Recruiter is very, very expensive for what is essentially a souped-up Goblin Matron. So this can definitely make Allurin more accessible to many players and also offer Allurin something very different in terms of sideboard options. It now gets to play Meddling Mage, Containment Priest, Aethersworn Canonist. All these really powerful hate bears are now accessible thanks to Recruiter of the Guard. Allurin will definitely get some benefits. I like how you mentioned the there's a lot of kind of unexplored space about what Recruiter of the Guard can do, though, because really everyone immediately thought of Death and Taxes and Allurin, but maybe you can just play this in some blue-white mid-range deck and get a Stoneforge or get some Meddling Mages in your main deck. There's a lot of room for this to be very, very powerful in Legacy.
All right, now going back to Death and Taxes one more time, you got to give me what you're thinking as far as numbers. Are you doing like 4 Recruiter of the Guards and how many Sanctum Prelates, or where are you at right now as far as where they actually fit into your Death and Taxes deck?
So with Death and Taxes, before we had a few flex slots in the 3-drop, like Thalia, Heretic Cathar was a recent one. Mirran Crusader has been a mainstay, and Serra Avenger has also been a card that's always been kind of occupying the 2-drop spot there in many lists. But now basically you shave away all those flex slots, keep the core of Mother of Rooms, Thalia, Stoneforge, Revoker, and Flicker Wisp, and you now maybe add 3 Recruiters. As I said, it's a very slow card. So if you open a hand with, say, 2 Recruiter of the Guards in it, you probably have to mulligan that. It's much too slow for the Legacy format. but you can put 3 Recruiter of the Guard in your deck and a bunch of silver bullets. Numbers will really need to be figured out to make sure that the curve isn't really bulging at the 3-drop spot. But at the same time, I think 3 is a very good number for Recruiter so that you don't kind of on them.
All right, well, that has been our Conspiracy Take the Crown Legacy Countdown. So, Sean, do you have any final thoughts on Conspiracy as a whole for Legacy? Any of the specific cards? Anything else you wanted to mention on the way out the door?
I'm not sure why R&D loves Death and Taxes so much, but I'm not unhappy about it.
Yeah, it's a great time to be a white player, apparently. You got clearly the 2 best cards in the entire set, and Conspiracy is unique because it's one of the few products a year that really gives things to legacy players. So it has to be an exciting time for a legacy player because you don't really get that much from standard legal sets and most supplemental products.
Yeah, definitely. Conspiracy is where we can get some things really, really targeted at Legacy, as we have. And yeah, I'm glad they've been very nice to us.
Well, Sean, thanks so much for hanging out. It was a ton of fun. Hopefully, we'll do this again sometime in the future.
Thanks for having me on, Seth.
And thank you, everyone, for watching. So, anyway, that's been our Conspiracy Take the Crown Legacy Countdown. Thanks again for watching, and I'll talk to you soon.